Welcome to this webinar entitled Student Wellbeing and Pedagogy, Making Learning Contextual by Tapping into Students' Life Experience. My name is Rich Dixon. I'm the Senior Director of Innovative Learning here at Hāpara, and I'm really grateful to be joined today by Shayla Adams-Stafford. And she is the founder and CEO of AdaptiveX, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what that is at the end of this session. But to begin with, I'm going to give you an amazing overview of who she is. She is just an amazing collaborator. She's a national board certified teacher. She's been an educator. She's been recognized by the White House for her achievements in project-based learning. And she helps educators to be able to think specifically around how culturally responsive teaching can improve not only teaching practice, but the experience of students so they can be successful in all that they do within schools. So Shayla, we're going to dive into this and a little bit more about you as we go into this, but I want to welcome you and thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this really important topic.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have a conversation today on this webinar. It's going to be less of a formal walkthrough. And before we get going too much further, I do want to put a little bit of information on the screen, specifically about where you can find Shayla. We're going to see this is the end of the presentation, but for those of you that are watching and like to check out what she's been posting on Twitter and some of the awesome resources, you can do that. Again, you can find her at adaptivex.io, which is their website, or simply Google AdaptiveX and it'll pop right up. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and Shayla, we're going to start our conversation. We know that providing a sense of belonging and having students feel welcomed and safe is a critical first step in equipping them to be successful as students and learners. So one important technique to doing that is leveraging something called culturally responsive teaching. So can you explain what that means? Because there's a lot of both understanding and also some misunderstanding floating around there these days around that topic.
Yes, thank you so much, Rich, again for this opportunity. And I do apologize if I sound a little stuffed up. I have a little bit of a cold here, so yeah. But when we
So
talk
sorry.
about culturally responsive teaching and learning, really it's about understanding where students are coming from, giving an opportunity to create partnership with families, and bringing forward aspects of students' home culture and home lives into the classroom and making those connections through instruction. It really is also about not only bridging school and community, but it's also about literacy, right? Making learning accessible to everyone by using scaffolds, using events that are happening within the community, using different artifacts that tie into students' home lives and interests. And it's a really great way to make deep, meaningful connections with students in order to support engagement. And
Let's
a
break
huge
that down. Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say a huge part of culturally responsive teaching and learning is for educators to really have a strong sense of themselves and to have a strong sense of their students. And by having that knowledge, that equips educators really with the know-how in order to make and bridge those connections.
That's great. Well, let's dive in a little bit deeper. We're going to just start unpacking and get a little bit more specific with each of the questions that we go through today. But
Mhm.
Shayla, if we were to just lightly start the discussion at a high level around some of the ways that teachers can get to know their own selves perhaps a little bit better and be aware of what they're bringing when they make choices around curriculum and resources to the way that they present themselves and the way they create a classroom culture, what are some recommendations for how teachers can start their own journey to be more aware of those elements?
Yes, I think it's important for all educators to take time to really think about their own identity. How does your identity impact the way that you view yourself as an educator? How does it impact the way that you view your students and their communities and their families? Recognizing that we all come to this work from different starting points and we carry with us sort of uh, the we carry with us all of the stories and experiences that make us who we are. So we don't become teachers and just leave that at the door. We bring those beliefs and those biases with us. And so for us to think that we would then engage in this teaching relationship with students and not acknowledge that, it's interesting. I think a lot of people are recognizing that some of the long held thoughts that they've had about student learning really come from some outdated beliefs. And so the first step here is for educators to really take time to think about their own identity. How does that impact the way I view my students? How does that impact the way I view myself? And then also, it's important for educators to uh, consider a continual process of recognizing those biases. So it's not enough to just do it once. It has to be really a practice, a way that we have rewired our brains to think, you know, what bias am I bringing to this lesson? What bias am I bringing to this conversation? And really constantly deconstructing bias and interrupting some of the automatic assumptions that we have about students, about learning, and what students and families can do.
Mhm. That's a great frame. And I think it moves us so nicely into the next thing that comes to my mind, which is, can you provide examples of how culturally responsive teaching can work and how that can not only be an opportunity for students to learn and have safety, but again, to what you were just talking about, how as teachers we can move ourselves and advance ourselves forward and how we can better serve students.
Yeah, so I would say culturally responsive teaching, what it can look like in the classroom is taking a current event that's happening within a community and bringing that in to be the basis of a lesson. For example, when I was teaching in Durham, North Carolina, we were learning about the Reconstruction era and sort of how that community changed and was, coming to be. And then during the Progressive era, how African Americans were having this amazing success with Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina. And so we also talked a bit about how the construction of a freeway sort of broke up that community. And so what we did was we looked at the historic Hayti community and we looked at some new developments that were happening in that region as well. And so we tied what had happened historically to the new developments that were happening today that were going to affect the lives of the students that live nearby there. And we talked about how urban renewal and urban development it can sometimes cause us to lose some of the historic, sort of meaningful artifacts that make a community a community. And so we were able to make those linkages, and actually students did some advocacy to the local zoning board about how to maintain some of that legacy. And so what that was taking a standard, right? Knowing we had to teach about Black Wall Street, right? But thinking about what's happening currently in that region and how do we link those two together to make it meaningful for students' lives. And so that was a project, but that's an example of how culturally responsive teaching can look.
And that's a great connection to my next point, which is examples and ways in which culturally responsive teaching can reinforce, support, and actually help us actualize the outcomes that standards are leading us toward. So do you want to talk about maybe another example of maybe how that is in alignment? Again, culturally responsive teaching practices and learning practices with achieving learning outcomes that are tied to standards.
So culturally responsive teaching and learning is 100% linked to student outcomes. Because when we think about how do we, even as adults, learn new topics or new concepts, we tie it to something that we're familiar with. We try to make sense of it in our mind, and then we think, okay, how can I apply this to a new situation? When this happens in the classroom, when educators uh, create some sort of familiarity with a new concept, it makes it easier for students to begin to unpack and understand that concept by making a connection to something that students already have a frame of reference for. Zaretta Hammond has done a lot of great work on this with culturally responsive teaching in the brain. So I recommend everyone check out her book. But it also builds on the work of Lisa Delpit and Gloria Ladson Billings. There are many examples of how having that strong understanding of students' interests, their communities, how that creates that bridge so students can find work accessible.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because Zaretta Hammond's work in the book that you mentioned, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, is for me was a really groundbreaking book that really helped for me um, reconsider how I was approaching the practice of teaching to meet
Mhm.
the needs of every single learner
Yeah.
with all the different in between identities and needs and their location within community, their place in history. And when
Mhm.
I mean every, I mean I truly do mean every with that. So that's great. Great recommendation there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some recommendations that you would have for educators who are, okay, I kind of got the idea now. I want to start my practice of culturally responsive teaching. We've mentioned a resource, very concretely a book, but where else might they go to get started? And then what are some concrete tips that you would have for them to help them get started on the journey? Because like anything else, there's not a magic bullet, quick, tomorrow you're going to be all 100% ready to go with this. This is going to be a journey. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would say, first starting off with some of the literature on this work, there's just a wealth of information out there on culturally responsive teaching and learning. And I would also say, having that sort of self-reflection time to really consider your own your own educational journey, your identity, your biases, but then also, getting connected with other educators that are interested in this work to really consider how can I improve some of my existing lessons to make them more culturally responsive. What are some very specific strategies that will allow me to really make this lesson engaging for all of my students? So those would be some of my first steps there.
Mm. It's really great. What are some common obstacles or challenges as people are growing into um, culturally responsive teaching and fostering culturally responsive learning for their students? And how might us as educators kind of have that in mind as we start our journey so that we can successfully move beyond those challenges?
Yeah, I'd say some of the challenges in really embracing culturally responsive education uh, can there are so many issues that can happen, especially if you're a school leader and you're looking to really raise the level of professional development for your staff around this topic. Often we find resistance from educators on culturally responsive education. Some folks may feel, well, I know all of my students. I know kids that come from this area, or I generally know these kids or those students, and you know, I've got an idea, right? And I think that that can lead to us reinforcing stereotypes and recognizing that students and their communities all change. And so that can often be a challenge. I think that oftentimes teachers, may create a lesson and they just know that it works. And so they sort of reuse that lesson year after year. I know what that's like. I was in the classroom for over a decade and I understand that. But I think that having that time built in to do some critical analysis, to actually maybe have some student voice in the discussion to say, well, Mr. and Miss So and so, when we did this last year, actually, it could have been enhanced with this, or it made more sense when we did X. Giving that space to have some feedback. That's absolutely one way that we can enhance lessons. But I think just another challenge just can be, um, educators uh, really not having the time and space to really dive deep into the topic and discussion on bias. Educators really might get 1 or maybe 1.5 days a year where they'll talk deeply about bias and unconscious bias and how that seeps into our work in the classroom. When in reality, educators really are in this sort of microcosm of society every day, where race and gender and all of these different things come together at a head every single class period. And you're having these tough conversations, and you're having these realizations with students. And oftentimes, educators feel underprepared for a lot of these conversations. And so, my call to schools and districts is that we need to prioritize bias training, anti-bias training for educators, just like we prioritize, literacy training, because really one of the biggest drivers of the opportunity gap is educators' expectations of students, particularly of students of color. And that all ties into bias and really, having low expectations for certain groups of students. And so really my call would be for folks to really consider, how do we continue to have ongoing anti-bias, anti-racist work, professional development throughout the year, so that we're constantly, like I said, holding that mirror up to ourselves in our practice.
Yeah, and I think I know one thing that you've helped me with, and a few of our colleagues over the years in education broadly, Shayla, has been seeing this as a growth opportunity and with a growth mindset. As we each have our own experiences, our own ways that we see the world, and instead of seeing that as a liability or something that has intentionally a liability, I guess, would be an opportunity to see that as a strength, and also be very open to input and finding safe partners, people that we can have these conversations with as we grow and receive professional development in these areas. And I think, Shayla, one thing that comes to my mind is, how do we make space in a busy schedule? I mean, when we're in the classroom, the days are so fast paced. And if you're a secondary teacher, we've got so many kids that are coming in and out and in and out. And it's
Mhm.
really easy to just blur. And unless a student is, particularly stands out for one reason or another, it's kind of hard to get to know students. So what are some ways that you would recommend that we go about increasing our knowledge of students that would be in alignment to the principles that you're speaking to?
Yeah, I would say, some easy ways to understand students and their communities and culture would really, maybe start off by doing a walking tour of your school community. For a lot of educators we work with, they drive into their school and they leave out, right? They don't actually spend a lot of time in the immediate community around the school. So maybe doing a walking tour. Where do your students go to get snacks after school? What what institutions are nearby to your school? Is there a church nearby, a recreation center? Getting to know the actual community, spending time attending, cultural events that are happening within the community that aren't necessarily school sponsored, but just to kind of understand where you may intersect with students that are, where students are engaging in different activities, just so that you can gain some knowledge and understanding. Looking up the history of your school's community. I think that sometimes when we're working with teachers and school leaders, a lot of them, they can tell you maybe the history, maybe 5 to 10 years. But when you start going back even further, then they start to realize, oh wow, this has always been, for example, when one educator realized this has always been a community that has been welcoming for new immigrants, right? And this community was maybe built for new immigrants coming here from this part of the world. And so having that understanding can help bridge our understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities that we have today. So, understanding that historical narrative, I think, is a really great way to get started.
Really practical and really helpful.
Mhm.
Well, Shayla, this has been a really wonderful conversation, and we've just literally touched barely the top of this mountain here.
Yes, definitely.
And I would love to have you share a little bit more about what you do at AdaptiveX, how you help educators and school leaders to be able to move forward in this work so that all students have a sense of belonging, so that they can feel successful and be successful as they learn. And I believe deeply that that increases student engagement and better and deeper learning outcomes when students do have those conditions in place. So, Shayla, tell us a little bit about your work.
Yes, yes. So I'm happy to talk about AdaptiveX. We are a professional development and software company that focuses specifically on culturally responsive teaching and learning. And by that, I mean really helping educators pair their understanding of the biases and beliefs that they bring into the classroom with evidence-based strategies to really help to meet the needs of all students. And so we pair with states, with districts, with schools to provide ongoing support for these equity initiatives. So we provide professional development workshops, ongoing coaching, equity landscape analyses, all to really help further the work of culturally responsive teaching and learning. And so right now we're currently in about 50 schools across the nation in 6 different states. And it's just been a really amazing experience to help, really, I love when we're working specifically with educators, helping them to realize, how they can take sort of what they're already doing, enhance it, and just seeing how those outcomes have really led to increased engagement with their students. So
It's so
that's
great. And Sheila, a number of our viewers will be from different parts of North America and
it.
around the world, including New Zealand and Australia. And one
Yeah.
of the things that I think is really intriguing about your work is that I believe that it's not just US centric, that it actually works across the board in a number of different cultural contexts because the same principles apply, whether we're working with First Nations students, if I'm in Canada, for example, or different student populations throughout New Zealand, Australia, or elsewhere around the globe. And so for those of you that are in those regions, I also encourage you to take a deeper look into the work that Shayla and her team are doing. So with that, in closing, what I'd like to do is just say a huge thank you to you, Shayla. You can reach out to Shayla Adams-Stafford here. It's on the screen. Her Twitter handle is Stafford_Shayla. And again, she's the founder and CEO of AdaptiveX. You can find them at adaptivex.io. And if you didn't catch that, if you at least look up and Google AdaptiveX, you will find the work that she and her team are doing. Shayla, thank you for helping us to start a discussion around this topic. And I encourage all of you viewers to consider the ways that we can best build the capacity of our students to feel safe, again, so that they can be engaged and successful in achieving of the learning targets represented in our learning standards. So Shayla, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Rich. It's been great chatting with you today.